Hello, this is Dr. Benjamin Smith, lecturer in philosophy with Catholic Studies Academy. Welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our podcast where we examine the 2,000-year-old Catholic intellectual tradition. Today, I am joined by our special guest, Mr. Joseph Grossheim, graduate student in philosophy at the Center for Thomistic Studies in Houston, Texas. In our previous episode, we discussed the Aristotelian thesis, our principle, that nature acts for an end. That is, so we spent some time working on natural teleology or natural finality, and really working through what Aristotle has to say in the physics about natural finality. That was, I think, a really good discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope that our listeners did too. Once you sort of get that, it's a really important claim, right? It's a really different view of nature, to be sure, than probably the modern view of nature. So it's kind of enriching in that way, and I think also just helps us to understand the world better, to have a truer picture, right, of nature. But certainly also, if you've paid attention at all, recognize that natural teleology is the foundation for the natural law, right? And that is for understanding of virtue ethics and objective ethics and all that sort of thing. So really critical premise, a really critical sort of theory idea. Today, we're going to expand on that. Last time, at the end of our conversation, we talked about the idea that that natural finality, once you've accepted it, opens you up to the fifth way, that is arguments about natural theology, natural sort of metaphysics, leading really should lead one to recognize the existence of God. I think, so we're going to talk about here the fifth way, right? But before we do that, we're going to kind of recap a little bit our discussion from last time. Joe, do you want to maybe say a couple things about how we proceeded last time?
Points. What I might want to point out is what's at stake here. You pointed out a little bit of it, right? That if there's no order of things, the natural law is at stake. And what we mean is that we lose any concrete measure of human action. We're going to have to come up with something else. Right. And that's where classical ethics breaks down into modern ethics and all of its problems, right? So sure. If we don't have a teleology of things, we have no way of knowing whether they've reached their proper perfection, right? We've got to make something up.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
So that's one thing, right? The other thing is that really all of science depends upon order in nature, right?
That's right.
So if you want to say that at the bottom of things, right, is pure randomness, that it just happens to work out this way, right? You cannot draw necessary, true, and certain conclusions about the way things are. You can just say, well, this is what my observation is. I hope that your observation and your peer review of my observation is the same, right? And then we can get sort of like a likely account of what seems to be happening right now. That's a lot of qualifications.
That's right. Yeah.
There are problems with that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of what you're pointing to is like that our sort of relative certitude about science and science of the natural presupposes a structure, right, in which there is this kind of order really.
You want to study electrons and how they work, right? Well, if they don't always work the same, if they don't have a nature, right, you can't get very far, right?
That's right.
I think it's not only important, it's actually presupposed by anyone who's really studying science.
I think that's true. Even to maybe go one step further, I think, the reliability of our own reason, right, sort of presupposes that reason's ordered to the end of truth, right? And towards the end of, like, if it's just sort of this kind of, necessary outcome or byproduct, right, that may or may not be ordered to anything, right, then we really can't count on it, the reliability of that power, right, being naturally inclined towards truth and reality. So yeah, that's a premise with a lot of permutations and consequences.
Yeah, that's right. So the question now is, if we have correctly identified that nature acts for an end, I suppose the question is, what are the implications?
That's right.
Right. So where does reason take us from that established fact that nature acts to an end? What's the next question? Right.
Yeah. So, I think the next question is, well, given, right, that we have established that nature acts for an end, why? Right? Why does it do so? What is the cause? Now, one thing we want to straighten out very clearly, I think, from the beginning, is saying that nature acts for an end doesn't mean that trees are having intentions, right? Or that they are choosing, right? We're not implying that, correct, Joe?
Right. So we just mean that there is a regular directedness, or I don't want to use the word order again, but that they act always or for the most part so as to achieve the best results. Right?
That's good. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The best result for the kind of thing they are.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And I think that's again really enriching and interesting, right? In its own right, to think about nature as this kind of force, actuality, energy that strives towards it's a striving towards a certain kinds of perfection, right? That's embedded naturally into things. I'm using words like striving, right? Like we can't help it almost, right? It's kind of like when scientists talk about, DNA, signaling, right? Well, they're not like over there with flags, right? We kind of have to use these metaphors, somewhat anthropomorphic metaphors, but the reality isn't just a projection of the anthropomorphic, and I think that's what's key, right? And again, we know that from the arguments we dealt with last time, in natural philosophy, showing that randomness is not a sufficient account of nature. Even determinism is not a sufficient account. That really teleology is the best account. So given that that's the case, why is it the case? Why is it that nature is this sort of intrinsic reality, a reality intrinsic to natural substances, pushing towards an end, right? Inclined, right? There's almost, this is a little bit anachronistic, but there's a kind of, and I think this is really interesting. There's a kind of kinetic, right, feel to nature. Sometimes, I'm sure you've heard this, Joe, people sort of kind of, especially some philosophers or theologians, kind of rolling their eyes at the static Aristotelian world, right? And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. Right? Because the truth is, when like Aristotle's picture of nature is it is a kind of energy, right? That's intrinsic to natural substances and bodies, working itself out.
Yeah, it drives them forward to their perfection, right?
Yeah, it's a principle of motion. It's the opposite.
Yeah,
of static,
right. Yeah.
So it's in that sense, I think it gives you a really, as I say, a profound and enriched understanding of nature. But also it sort of opens us up to this broader question of, wow, it's fascinating that this is true. I think you and I share this view that one of the first things you really need to get really clear when you're studying Aristotle, we always want to jump to other things, right? But this is to get nature first. Like once you get nature, then a lot of other things open up, right? And maybe there's other starting points. We don't have to get into that argument, but it really does help, right? To get that view of nature down clearly. And then once you do, you say, okay, why? Like here's this fascinating reality, nature. Why is it like this?
Yeah. So the text that you had in mind to look at, right, we're talking about this this inclination, right? And what it means and how it could or doesn't relate to the intentionality that we usually use to discuss these terms for like human actions, right?
That's right.
So it might be helpful to point out that like Aristotle and St. Thomas following him will use the word appetite to talk not just about like a human appetite. Like that's the way, most of us and our listeners are going to think about the word. Like I have an appetite, a desire, an inclination to go get food, let's say, right? That's the most baseline definition of appetite we have now. But he'll also talk about, this might seem strange to us, but a natural appetite that non-living substances have, right? So like a rock has a natural appetite, right? Not to eat or do anything that living things do, but to fall to the ground, right? So they would have said, or maybe today we would say to move towards the local center of gravity, right?
Sure.
Such that that's what the rock sort of quote unquote wants to do.
Right. Yeah.
But we have to be careful with this word wants, right? We don't want to imply that a rock is choosing something, but rather that it just does something as long as you don't prevent it.
That's right. Yeah. And similar, I mean, I think that's a good example. Living things are a good example, right? In terms of the tree wants to extend its roots down into the fertile soil. As that seed is developing, it has an appetite to do so, right? Its nutritive powers are exercised, in that, or given the opportunity to exercise in that way. We would add, of course, also, with the sun as well, reaching up towards the sun, right? We use that language, reaching up towards, right, the sun. We talk about the arms of a tree. That's, of course, for us going from what's more known to us, right, to something else. So as long as you don't make the mistake of applying those terms univocally, right, where you're saying, oh, it wants in the way I want, okay, then you're okay. I think what it maybe helps to alleviate some of that worry about the anthropomorphic language there is to recognize that actually our version of wanting is a smaller subset of the broader phenomena of wanting, right? So that action for an end, right, is so much broader than human action for an end, right? In fact, in the sea of finality that exists, okay, we're smaller than the vast finality that we're surrounded by that doesn't use direct intentions or volitions or thoughts. Isn't that right?
Yeah, of course. So we would then want to establish that there's this broad category of things that move to an end. And in that category, there's a subcategory of things that move towards an end and know that they are moving toward an end, right? That directly even choose the actions that they're going to that are going to be productive of that end.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that kind of helps you recognize, right, that we're not just anthropomorphizing here, right? We're using anthropomorphic language because it helps us to understand, but we're using that of a reality that really is there, right? So once we've kind of maybe cleared up that possible mistake, we're still left with this really fascinating question of, well, why is it that nature acts this way, right? And one thing, you could say, but this is kind of a, I don't know, hand waving kind of answer is, well, it's nature. It just does, right? Okay. But that's not really an answer, is it? Right. I mean, nature's are generated and corrupt, right? They come into being, they cease to be. So we still have that phenomenon is, why is it that nature is such, right? That it acts for an end. And I think Thomas has an answer to this that really elevates our consideration. We've been acting as physicists or natural philosophers, right? In the language of Aristotle. Once you start looking at what Aquinas has to say about this, we start to act like natural theologians, right? We begin to see a reduction, a line of argumentation that actually leads up to the first cause, right? This time, though, the first cause in the order of finality. So if you're familiar at all with like the 5 ways of Thomas Aquinas, we're going to be dealing with what's called the 5th way here in a few minutes. But in order to understand why the 5th way makes so much sense, right? There's the 5th way of arguing for the existence of God. It's helpful to us to kind of move slowly from the fact of nature acting for an end to why it does so.
Yeah. And why, well, maybe what would be helpful here is to consider an example from the text, right? Which is the arrow.
Yes.
I think that's maybe a good place to start.
Sure.
And I think I used a similar example last time. When we were talking about this, I talked about Mars, and if we found like an ordered position in the stones on the ground, like if you found like on Mars a series of concentric circles of stones, right? We would recognize that order does not belong to the stones, to have, right? But that if there's some sort of order there, that order requires an explanation, because the stone is not the explanation, right? So the the arrow, right?
Sure.
If you want to talk about like the substance of it, what is it? Well, it's wood. And what is its natural appetite? To fall to the ground. Just like the stone. So if we have a wooden shaft that's being directed to something else, like the bullseye, right? That's going to require some sort of account outside of the arrow.
That's
right?
right.
We're going to need some sort of mind to assign that function, right? That perfection to the shaft.
That's right. So another maybe way of putting this is that the ratio of wood is not a sufficient explanation for wood hitting a target in the same place on a regular basis.
Right.
Like you could know everything there is to know about wood, and you wouldn't say, "Oh, it's going to do that."
Right.
That pushes you to look for something else. So here's this passage that I think helps us to understand all of this, and this is in what's called the first part of the second part in Latin, the Prima Secunda. This is the section really of the Summa that deals primarily with questions about human action and ethics and morality and that sort of thing, as well as the passions and so forth. But along the way, Thomas, includes comments that illumine other parts of his work. And here in the opening questions and articles, he's dealing with human action and action for an end. And he asks in question 1, article 2, whether it is proper to the rational nature to act for an end. Now, when Thomas uses the term proper here, I think most of the time, you correct me if you think I'm wrong about this, Joe, but most of the time here, proper means something like specific to.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So he's asking, is it specific to rational nature to act for an end? Now, of course, he's going to affirm, and he does in the article 1, that human beings, that is rational animals, act for an end, right? And then he's going to use all of this account of human action in his, detailed work in ethics. But in article 2, he wants to correct a possible misunderstanding, as well as deepen what he's established in article 1, because he's actually going to say it's not specific, right, to the rational nature to act for an end. So if you don't get that idea, the correct understanding of proper there, you might kind of be thrown off a little bit, right? Because it's not specific to human beings to act for an end. It is specific to human beings among creatures to act for an end in a certain way, right? But not just simply to act for an end, right?
Right. And so the difference he wants to draw out in this question, or this article rather, is that the rational nature, the nature which knows, moves to an end by itself, or not as directed by another, but as a sort of self-directed thing.
That's right.
That's right. But there's an immediate question that you might have, right? And that's that, isn't the rock self-directed to the ground, right? Isn't that what we mean by saying that the rock has a nature?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what does Thomas mean here by being moving yourself to an end rather than being moved by another to an end?
Right. Yeah. That's a good setup here. So what I'm going to do is just read through the first part of his answer, and then we'll stop and discuss it, and then move on to the second part. So he says, I answer that every agent, notice he says every agent, right? Every agent of necessity acts for an end. And why is this? For if a number of causes ordain to one another, the first be removed, the other must of necessity be removed also. Now, the first of all causes is the final cause.
Could we maybe just pause on that point? I think we might want to explain that, right? What he means when he says that if in a number of causes ordained to one another, the first be removed, the others of necessity must be removed also. Aristotle gives a good example of this in the beginning of the Nicomachean Ethics. He talks about the art of horsemanship and what it's ordered to, or the making of horseshoes or bridles. I think it is. That's even prior to that, right? So if you are going to make horse bridles, right, there has to be a reason why. Nobody makes them for their own sake. And of course, the reason why you're going to make horse bridles is so that you can ride horses, right? If there was no need ever, to ride a horse. Let's say a horse didn't exist. You will not make horse bridles.
That's right.
So that's what you say. If in a number of causes that are ordained to another, for example, horse bridle making and horsemanship, right? Horse bridles are being ordained to the purpose of riding horses. If you remove the first, not the first in the order of execution, but the first in terms of the intention behind the action. If you remove horsemanship,
that's right,
there will be no bridle making.
That's right.
Right. That's what we're saying here.
Yeah. That's good. And what you're pointing out here as horsemanship is in your example would be this first of the causes is the final cause, right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So the reason is that matter does not receive form. So metal wouldn't receive the form of a bridle, save insofar as it is moved by an agent, for nothing reduces itself from potency to act. That's just basic kind of Aristotelian, natural philosophy. There, we have your hylomorphic unity. You have form and matter. Matter doesn't reduce itself to form. Rather, the form has to be imposed upon the matter by an agent.
Right. So if you have the potentially hot water, that water itself cannot make itself to be actually hot, right? We need something else to make it actually hot. It doesn't just happen on its own, right?
Yeah. And if you've ever been sort of backpacking and anxiously awaiting for the coffee to actually make, it's like the only time instant coffee actually tastes good. Like the water is just potentially hot. It's not really hot until you've put enough fire to it, right? To make it happen. Okay. But an agent does not move except out of an intention for an end, right? So out of going towards a goal, right? For if the agent were not determined to some particular effect, it would not do one thing rather than another. So Aristotelian, right? So there's a lot of different things, right, you could do, but there has to be a determination to one such that you do it rather than the other options.
Right. And that really just goes back to that opening line, right? If there was not something to act for, then you do not act.
That's right.
So, yeah, right. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah. Consequently, in order that it produce a determinate effect, it must of necessity be determined, I might say actualized, right, to some certain one, which has the nature of an end. And just this determination or actualization is affected in the rational nature by the rational appetite, which is called the will, right? So you imagine, you think about in a human being, you have a lot of alternatives. What could I do with the next hour of the day? Right. And you kind of sit there for a few minutes, kind of daydreaming, deliberating, right? I could spend the next hour doing this, or this, right? But at some point you intend, right? That is, you apply your will to get it done, right? Not simply to wish it to happen, but to affect that it happens, right? And that moves you to choose means, including getting up out of the chair, right? To carry out what you're going to do for that hour. We do that through rational appetite, right? Which is called the will, right? So there's a volitional character right there that focuses, I would say, on intention, choice, and command. That's a very psychological way of talking about the determination towards an end, right? Proper to things with a psyche, right? Like a will and so forth, right? But he doesn't stop there. He could stop there, which is really interesting, but of course he doesn't, because he, like Aristotle, thinks nature acts for an end. So he says, so in other things, that is things that aren't rational, it is caused by their natural inclination, which is called the natural appetite. That brings that together. What you were talking about, Joe, is we see a parallel here, right? In rational creatures, we have a rational appetite, right? And there's very complex and interesting, but it's a rational appetite that involves a volitional movements, right? And operations towards an end. In natural things, we don't have that same sort of volition, right? So like we were talking about earlier, trees are not intending and choosing, right? But they still have a natural inclination towards the development of roots, which is called the natural appetite, Right. So again, really interesting comparison there. Did you want to add anything there?
Well, just that the point, it seems, is that we need this sort of account, right? We have things that are acting that are not rational, right? Like trees and rocks and dirt and everything, right? So if these are going to produce any action whatsoever, there has to be a final cause. Just as in the example of bridle making and horsemanship, right? If you remove horsemanship, there's no bridle making. And then he goes on to talk about how if there were no determination to any particular action through final causality, through ordination to an end, there would be no action. Yet there is action.
That's right.
Therefore,
there must be a determination doing it. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Very good. Okay, and not just action, but regular action, intelligible action, predictable action, right? All those sorts of things, right? So that somebody who had the art of bridle making, would probably do it in a way that's very routine-like, right? And there would be some predictable steps, right? And he might slap the apprentice's hand at some point and say, "No, you're doing it wrong, idiot."
Right.
I told you to do it this way, right? Similarly, in natural things, right? We see a sort of orderliness, right? This is kind of and predictability, right? That includes action for an end, right? And so we have that natural inclination as the account of it, right? Does that seem right to you? That natural inclination is the account, right? Towards that end. So now we have the parallels set up. I hope that's clear to everyone. Now I'm going to continue on with the second half. Now I know reading long form like this isn't the best, but go read this for yourself. Again, this is in the first part of the second part. Question 1, Article 2.
Could we put a link in the description to where that would be a good idea for us?
Yeah, we'll make sure that happens. So, so I'll continue on here. This is the second part because this is where he really starts to draw some of the things we want to pay attention to. It says, nevertheless, it must be observed that things tend to an end by its action or movement in two ways. First is a thing moving itself to an end as man. Secondly, as a thing moved by another to an end. And here's our lovely example. As an arrow tends to a determined end through being moved by the archer, who directs his action to the end. Okay? So we've already kind of discussed this some, but if I ask you, what you were doing, I would expect that you could give me an account, right, of your intentions and choices that would explain, say, your behavior over the last hour. Right. And that's because your intentions and choices are what is moving you towards that end. Is that right?
Yeah.
And we could talk about you then as the author, right, of that movement towards an end. But we can't really do that with the arrow, right? The arrow is not the flight of the arrow into the target on a regular basis is not accounted for simply by the arrow. Right now, after the fact, I think you could see that an arrow is fitted to do that sort of thing, right?
Right.
You would let's say you've never seen an arrow before, but then all of a sudden you see an arrow being shot regularly into a target, and you examine it. Well, you're going to see, oh, this is a tool, an instrument, to this end, right?
Yeah.
But the arrow is not a sufficient account. Why? Because all of its composition, first off, with an arrow, its composition is artificial. Arrows don't grow, right? On trees, right? So it's not something natural. And then secondly, even if you were to break it down into its component parts, the wood and the steel and the feathers, or the iron head, I should say, and then the feathers, they're not sufficient account, right? Again, you can know everything there is about feathers, and it wouldn't make you think about the fletching of an arrow or the arrow hitting the target on a regular basis, right?
Right.
So we can have these two, we have a contrast here between sort of the voluntary self-directed movement of a man, a rational animal, and the other directed action of an arrow. Now he draws his conclusion. Therefore, those things that are possessed of reason move themselves to an end because they have dominion. Great word. I love that. Governance, right? Dominion over their actions through their free will. Note, both Joe and I would prefer the translation free choice. But because
the Latin is not voluntas, it's
that's
RPGM,
right.
right?
That's right. Librum arbitrium. That's right. but that's another podcast.
Yeah.
Over their actions through their free choice, which is the faculty of will and reason. But those things that lack reason, to the arrow, tend to an end by natural inclination, as being moved by another and not by themselves. So when we stop there, so it can be, the arrow, of course, is art. It's not nature. It's a piece of art that's being used here to illustrate what nature's like. So now let's move back to a natural example. Let's talk about the wolf chasing the young caribou, right? So the wolf is naturally inclined to chase weaker and slower prey, right? And so it's going after, like when you watch that documentary, there's this documentary on the wolves of Yellowstone that just stands out in my imagination. But when you're watching that wolf go across the snow, right, towards that caribou, right, it's like the air, it's similar to an arrow shot at a target. Okay. So it is true to say it's its nature that inclines it to this action, right? That its nature is like an arrow shot towards, I mean, it would be stupid to remonstrate with the wolf, right? Besides that it can't speak or reason. It's doing what it does, right? I mean, this is its nature. It'd be like arguing against a rock falling, right? Mm-hmm. It's shot towards pursuing the caribou. But then the question is, but how so? Right? Like, granted that it's shot towards that end, how is that the case, right? He says by another,
right? And the question underlying that is really, why can it not be just by itself?
That's right.
What's the difference between the wolf and man, who we're going to say does direct himself to the end, right? The wolf, why does the wolf need to be directed by another rather than himself? Right?
That's right. Yeah. Excellent point. Way to put it. And Thomas is going to give us the answer here. And this is really the key premise, I think, to this way of thinking, and that opens us up towards thinking about a higher cause, right, that's involved in finality. And so he gives his explanation. Since they do not know the nature of an end as such, so why do they have to be moved by another? Since or because they do not know the nature of an end as such, and consequently cannot ordain anything to an end, but can be ordained to an end only by another. So here, right, Joe, it seems what he's saying is, look, it's only possible to ordain something to an end if that agent is capable of understanding something as an end, right? It has to, it requires an agent who can conceptualize end and means, right?
Yeah.
Right. In order to ordain something to an end, right? So you'd have to be able to understand.
You'd have to be able to
end, right?
To reason, right? So there's probably a really a better way to do this than explain it the way I'm about to. I'm sure that we could talk about the nature of an end and how grasping the end requires the capacity to grasp the universal. But I'm struck by an example from my own dog, and his incapacity to reason about things, right? So we play this awful game with him where we take his toy, and we we act like we're hiding it from him, and then he goes wild looking for it, But like he has all of these associations of particulars with the toy, and it's being hidden. So like if our hand is empty and he sees that our hand is empty, but I stick my hand in the couch like I'm going to hide his toy in there like I have before, right? But my start with an empty hand, I put my hand like even though his toy is on the floor in front of him, he will jump on the couch and go looking for his toy in there, right? Because he can't navigate this, right? He can only navigate particulars and associations between particulars, right? So he has his association of my hand going in the couch and his toy being in the couch, and he cannot focus on anything else. He just immediately will jump onto the couch to go looking for his toy.
That's right. Yeah, right? Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. That's good on the negative side. Let me give you a positive account.
Yeah, good.
So let's say you're in raising your children, right? Over time, what you want them to learn is how to do things by a plan, right? How to do things by an order, and really, one of the things you end up doing is, and I ask my kids this: why am I telling you to do this? Right? I asked them, right? I'm trying to get them to think about the idea that there's a particular end, right? In this case, right? That we want our home to be comfortable and be able to find things efficiently and that sort of thing, right? We're able to take care of our property and so forth. Those would be some of the ends, right? That I'm ordering them to clean their room or to sweep the house or things like that, right? What I'm trying to teach them then is the idea of doing things by a plan, doing things on a routine, right? And you might go through a lot of different examples, like in sports, like if you ever have any role as a coach, right? You spend time trying to get the players to understand this is why we do the routine, right? And so across really the development of a human being, a lot of what we're trying to teach them is to be able to spot the idea of there's a goal, and in order to achieve that goal, you muster various means, right? And so in the education, right, of a human being, really, I mean, we don't think about it this way too often, but you're always learning about how to subordinate various operations to a good, right? This especially comes across if you've ever done anything in the trades or in a craft, right? Where you learn to subordinate various actions towards a specific end, right? Over time, as a rational agent, I think this is true of being a rational agent. A lot of being a rational agent is being able to see that relationship between, right, ends and means. What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I'm lacking the words to explain this well, but it is clear that the act of deliberation, which is to say the act of evaluating different means in their relation to an end, is something that only reason can do.
That's right.
Right. That dogs, I mean, you'll see this in dogs, you'll see it in young children. They don't consider different options, right? When there's something in front of them that they want, they just go, right? And they just do it. Whereas a rational agent can set a plan and execute the plan, right? Sure. A rational agent can set a remote end, something that is connected with what he's about to do, but is not the same as what he's doing now.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
Though there are some difficult examples in animals that might, come up, like beavers, for example. You might think that the beaver that is gnawing the wood, right, is doing it for the sake of building his dam, right?
Yeah.
So what do you think about beavers here? Are they operating intentionally?
No, but they are operating with finality, right? Yeah. That is, they are ordered to do that. And the way you can tell that, I think, is the lack of variety, right, in beaver dams, right? The lack of development in beaver dams.
Yeah.
Right. You would think, if they could conceptualize fishing and housing together, right? Then surely at some point they would be able to come up with a better version, right? That they could build, or a variety.
Yeah.
Build, right?
I think to support that, I can't remember the exact nature of the experiments, but I remember some details. But Jean-Henri Fabre, right? Okay. He explored this in animals, and I think he used maybe silkworms, and maybe wasps, right? I think the silkworm is the one I remember the best, but like you might think that the silkworm is acting in this really intricate and complex way, but the truth is that they're really just responding to some external stimuli that's sort of directing them to do a certain thing, which just happens to produce an end result, right? But that the silkworm doesn't know this, right? So he could take the silkworm and manipulate the stimuli and get the silkworm to do something totally different just by manipulating the stimuli, because the silkworm cannot recognize that what it's doing is ordered to some further purpose.
Sure.
Right. But that rather it's just going to do what it does.
Sure.
And whether it produces that result or not is sort of incidental as far as the silkworm is concerned.
That's right.
It's just responding to some immediate stimuli, right?
Yeah,
so you can manipulate the stimuli and totally change the result. In the animal will still act the same way. And I think maybe even a better, more at home example is in the Domestication of Animals.
Sure.
Right. Where we take an animal that wants to act a certain way, and we just manipulate the situation so that it works out for our advantage, right? The animal's just doing its thing. It doesn't know that it's part of this.
That's right. It doesn't think I'm contributing to the farm, right?
Right, exactly.
That's right. That's a good example. One other element here that just comes to mind as we're going through this is that when you think about animal cognition, not to muddy the water too much here, but we're not trying to deny that there's no cognitive activity in animals. Of course, animals do, especially the higher level animals do have, some cognitive activity, broadly construed. That is, they can imagine, they can remember, they can associate, they can sense, right? And they can sense in somewhat complex ways, right? They have access to both the proper sensibles and the common sensibles, right?
Yeah.
And so when you start to bring all that together, actually, animal cognition can be fairly robust, although limited, right? But in that animal cognition, there just is no proper or common sensible that is bonum universale, right?
Yeah,
it is, the good in general, right? They just lack the faculty to abstract out a general notion of good such that they could order things to an end.
Right. That's good. So like if a dog can't decide on its own, like whether it's going to drink food or eat food or drink water.
Correct.
Right? Because it cannot see like this commonality of goodness in the food or the water, right? It's going to respond to the stimuli of being hungry or being thirsty, and that there's food in front of me or there's water in front of me. That's right? It's certainly not going to moderate itself, like go on a diet, right? Because it sees that like there's some good in not eating the food, right? It's like I'm stimulated to eat food, I'm going to eat food, right? And that's why we have to give our pets diets.
That's right.
They're not going to do it themselves.
Yeah,
right?
Black labs are a great example of that. Poor things, right? They just get rotund before, just so easily, right?
Yeah, my pug is the worst.
But go back to your there you go. You go back to your example of animal husbandry and so forth. That you think about all the goods that we order animals to that they couldn't possibly conceptualize as good on their own, right? But we can for everything from farming to art to warfare. I mean, like there's so many goods that we can order animals to that they would just. It literally would never cross their cognitive power.
That's great. Like you think about the ox that's pulling the plow and farming the field so that it can grow grain that you're going to feed the ox with, right? The ox has no idea. The ox is like strapped in. It's like, ow, kicked me. I'm going to move.
And you think about the constraint and think about what you use to provoke that activity, right? You use some coercion, you use some reward, use very basic kinds of stimuli. You don't try to convince them of it. Right? Now, maybe dogs are a little different, but I think a lot of what we do with dogs, really trades on their sociability, right? They are social animals, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
So humans have learned these cues, and dogs learn social cues, such that we are able to kind of give some sort of "I'm pleased with you." And dogs are set to recognize that the superior in a pack and be pleased that the superior in the pack is pleased with them. Does that make sense?
And we do it with dogs, right? By imitating the very stimuli that the dogs would use to interact with each other, right? Like a high pitched noise might be something either pleasant or painful, depending on how you nuance it, right? Or a very low growling voice would be something, displeasant, right? So that's how we do it, right? We manipulate the stimuli.
Yeah. Good. So I hope that was kind of a little bit of rabbit trail, but I hope that our listeners can understand, right, why it's important, right? Because what we're trying to get here is this key premise that without sufficient intelligence, right, to recognize end as end, it's not possible to ordain things to an end, right? Now, and I'll just draw here Thomas's finish out what Thomas says here. He says, for the entire, this is great. So we have an application of the principle. For the entire irrational nature in comparison to God as an instrument to the principal agent. That's great. I mean, it's just, all of nature compared to God is almost like art. I don't want to go that far, but it's like an instrument, right? Consequently, sorry, go ahead.
It's like it in the sense that there is an assigned order to it, right? Because the order can't be found in its own in itself, right? That it has to be given to it by another.
Right? That's right. Yeah. Consequently, it's proper to the rational nature to tend to an end. So here we get the proper. It's specific to the rational nature to tend to an end as directing and leading itself to the end, where it is proper to the irrational to tend to an end as directed or led by another. That is specific to, right? So really we're getting kind of a per se relationship here, right? An essential relationship, whether it apprehend the end as do irrational ends or do not apprehend it. So I think that's helpful in terms of getting at the kind of the nub here, right? Which is that both irrational and rational agents act for an end. Rational agents do it by directing themselves to an end. Irrational agents, right, do it by being directed by another, right? And that's because they lack the intellectual hardware, essentially, to do that directing. Now, in saying that, that does not deny that the wolf going after the caribou, that action is built into, right, the nature and being of the wolf, right? That's true, right? The question, so it is intrinsic, right, to the animal, to the wolf. The question is, why are wolves so construed, right, or so constructed? Why is that built into it, right? And again, you could say, well, nature is passed on through generation, but that's just still movers, right? That's still just that sort of horizontal level of causality. What we're really going to need is, that's not enough. What we need to know, right, is how it comes to be, why it is that wolves are that way. And to do so, we're going to have to resolve to a higher level of being, right? That is intellectual being, that's capable of accounting for the fact of something being ordered to an end.
Yeah. Maybe an important footnote here, though it is a footnote, right, is that we're being very clear, and we're really pushing the angle that the irrational nature requires another to direct it to its end, right? And we're saying with St. Thomas that the rational agent directs itself to the end. But this is not to say that the human agent does not have an end which is assigned to him in his nature too, right? So the human nature, just like in this case the irrational nature, has an end, right? And it's inescapable, right? You do not choose that end. So what Thomas calls it is happiness or beatitude, right? That's what you are ordered to, and everything you do, no matter what you want to say, is for the sake of that end. But what the rational agent does, how he does direct himself here, is not when it comes to happiness, but when it comes to the thing in which happiness will be found, right? So Thomas, right. So Thomas is going to go on from here to navigate away from just the notion of the last end itself, which is happiness, to investigate that question, right? Which is, how ought we to direct ourselves so that we can achieve this end that our nature is ordered to? That is, what ought we to choose as the thing in which our happiness will be found, or rather, what is that one thing which can actually meet or agree with the end assigned to us by nature? So human agents too have an end which is inescapable.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that also is going to require a cause, and it's ultimately going to resolve back to God as well.
That's right. Yeah. So ultimately, right, God's going to be the account for why we have happiness as our ultimate end.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay. Now, once we have all this in mind now, right, we've got, I think, a pretty robust sense of the Aristotelian picture of nature acting for an end. also why it's the case that nature's not a sufficient, it's a true but incomplete explanation of action for an end, right? And the sufficient explanation is actually we're only going to arrive at that when we reach up to God. And this is Thomas deals with this at the, of course, in the Prima Pars, and his that is the first part of the Summa, in his famous Quinque Via, that is the 5 ways. This will be a very short passage to read, but I'll stop at each sentence here so we can apply. It's interesting, Joe, having walked through this so slowly, right? Especially given the last episode, when you teach the 5th way in an intro class, it's kind of persuasive to some people, right? But you get this like 4 lines, right? And really, it's about 2 hours of really heavy going conversation to really understand all the premises that are in the 5th way, right?
Yeah.
If you think about it. So, all right. So here we go, though. I'm going to read through this and I'll stop along the way. The 5th way, that is the 5th way of demonstrating God's existence, is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, now this language will start to feel very familiar to us, right? Such as natural bodies, act for an end. Now we've spent a whole episode, right, trying to argue for why that's the case, okay? And this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Okay, action for the good, through the roots of the tree, right, growing down into the ground.
Right, and that qualification you made earlier is important, right? It's the best for that thing.
That's right.
Right, specifically is what we're talking about.
That's right. Okay, so again, all of this is packed into our previous conversation. Hence, it is plain that not fortuitously, or that is randomly, but designedly do they achieve their end, right? So again, that's just nature acting for an end. Okay. Now, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end unless it is directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence. And here's our example: as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer, right? I just tell you what, sometimes you just hit on the right metaphor and you might as well just not change it for 1,000 years. Right? Like Aristotle gets the archer and the arrow in the conversation, and that's it. Like, but anyway, so now this should sound very familiar to us, given this long conversation we've had, that whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, right? Why? Because it can't conceptualize the end as something that would move it. Right? Unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So go ahead.
Well, so to try to bring this all together here, right? We talked a lot about the stimuli that a animal, or not really a plant, but an animal, at least we can run with that example. An animal's reacting to a certain stimuli, and as a result, it performs a particular action, right? So that's not the question. The question is, why does it always perform the same particular actions, right?
That's right, yeah.
It's almost like it has a plan. It's almost like the tree's plan is to grow tall, to develop many leaves, and to ultimately reproduce and perpetuate its species, right? It's almost like the dog wants to please the man of the house so that it continues to get fed, but it can't be that way. It can't be that way because the dog can only respond to particular stimuli. It cannot have or grasp this end that it would somehow make a plan for.
That's right.
But all of its actions happen to be executed as if they are part of a plan.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
Very good.
And the dog can't make this plan. The plan has to come from something else.
That's right. Yep. Right. That's a great way of developing and explaining it, Joe. I like that. Really interestingly, even Darwin conceded in some of his writings. He said, if I look at the world, it looks planned. Right. And it does. I mean, it just looks planned, right? Especially when you start multiplying examples like bees and wolf packs and things like, especially those kinds of examples, right? It looks planned, right? And Aristotle and Aquinas would say, well, it looks that way because it is, right? And so you can say the plan almost is kind of the nature, right? The plan is the nature, right? It is kind of like, to use some of the language we would use in the modern world about, say, programming, right?
Yeah.
You could say the animal reacts to the stimuli because in a certain way, and predictably so, because it's programmed to do so, right? It's designed to do so. Then the question is, well, where did the programming come from, right? Where did the design come from? Well, it can't come from unintelligent matter, right? Programming and design come from a mind, right? And so ultimately there must be some mind from which the order of nature is planned, right? I think when you bring all those elements together, it's a more powerful argument than philosophers tend to think, or contemporary philosophers. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, this is not the common. Maybe it's common. So there's an intelligent design argument out there that I call it the "what is the odds" or "what are the odds" argument, right?
Sure.
Where it looks at things and it's like, there's just no way that this happened without God, right? That trees happen to grow the way they do, and that the earth happens to be situated where it is. The chances of that happening are so remote that there has to be intelligence.
Right.
And it's a stronger argument than that, right?
Sure.
We're not talking about probabilities here. We're talking about the fact that anything which is irrational cannot act according to a plan.
That's
right?
Yeah.
Yet the plan is evidence in the regular and ordered operation of all things so as to achieve the best result for them.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's necessary then. It's not just probable. It's not
That's
a God of the gaps argument.
Sure.
Right.
But
it's that it's necessary that there is an intelligence, and that is such an intelligence that it can assign plans to natural things, right? To real substances. It can give them a sort of assignment.
That's right.
That they live out on their own. Right.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting when you look back at well, first off, very important that we see that there is a necessary connection here, right? So in philosophy, in Thomas's philosophy, we would call this a per se relationship, right, between cause and effect. It's not an incident. It's not incidental, right? That we're saying that finality essentially depends ultimately on intelligence, right? There is finality in the world. Therefore, ultimately, there must be some intelligence behind that finality, right? As you say, it's demonstrative. It must be. So I think that's very important. But this goes really, all the way back to as everything does, the pre-Socratics, right? Where I think it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Joe. Heraclitus, right, who ultimately says that it's mind, right? Is it Heraclitus?
Oh, these guys better than I do.
I think it's Heraclitus.
Defer to your judgment on this.
Because in a lot of ways I don't like Heraclitus because he's all into the flux matter, right? But I might be confusing him and Anaxagoras right here, but Plato or Socrates says, at some point in his own career that he says, I couldn't really make anything of natural philosophy until I accepted the idea that mind or logos is what's behind things, right? Behind nature, right? And I think that's, really fascinating, right? You could just think, you have, the earliest philosophers are mostly materialist, right? Not all of them, but most of them, everything is water, everything is fire, right? And that either fire or water, right? Or the something else that's like that. But the idea that mind is behind nature ultimately, right, and necessarily, is a very ancient view, and one that comes up again and again in philosophy. And I think there's different ways to try to bring it into view, but I think what Aristotle is really bringing into view here is finality, right? And that finality is the key to seeing how nature necessarily depends upon mind, not probably, but necessarily.
Yeah.
I think this is, now I do want to say that I think at a level, at a different level of knowledge, right? So not scientific knowing, but maybe probabilistically, right? That design in nature is kind of I think before the modern era, it was the default position, right? And the idea that there's some god or gods behind it, some sort of divine, planning, right? It's kind of the default position. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, if you weren't a Christian, you still thought there had to be some sort of direction, a deist position at the least, right? Where at least somebody wound the clock up and set it in motion, right? Yeah. I don't. Because there wasn't really another good way to interpret the facts, right?
That's
like
right.
We have Empedocles, right? The ox progeny.
That's right. That's right. Right.
Yeah, there's no evidence for that. We're digging up fossils of all sorts of seemingly functional looking creatures, right? They're not they're not dysfunctional monsters, but they've got a couple of legs and they've got some really sharp teeth that seem to be ordered to a certain function, right? So there really wasn't evidence that we just developed totally randomly, but then it becomes a little bit more complex when we start looking from not all of these totally random parts, but we start from very simple parts that gradually become more and more complex through Darwinian evolution. Right. That at least seems more plausible to people, right?
Yeah, than the ox progeny. But what's great about this argument, right, is it works regardless of that question, right? Because even if you do have the idea of some sort of Darwinian evolution, which I have some philosophical skepticism about, but aside from that, I will concede this point very clearly that even if it is true, that process would still be subject to this, right? This kind of finality. Right?
Yeah, even if it's not obvious, right? So there was an early way of interpreting Darwin that thought that that whatever evolutionary steps are taken are always better. Right. And that was soon rejected because it's clear that sometimes the mutations don't happen to work out well.
That's right.
Right. But nonetheless, even if mutations don't happen to work out well all of the time, I think you can say that nature's plan would include certain imperfections. I think this is a little complicated and perhaps a bit too far afield. Right. But if a moth is born black rather than brown in a forest, that's generally going to be bad for that moth and it's going to die because its camouflage is gone. But if it happens that you're burning coal next to the forest and industrial soot starts to cover the trees, then suddenly that black moth is the one that's going to get by, right? And if nature's goal here is to perpetuate the species of the moth, I think it's totally reasonable that nature herself, in the reproduction of her members, allows defects to obtain, right? So that it can try to anticipate the unanticipatable, right?
Sure.
That would be my way of trying to.
I can see that. I can see that. That works, I think, in some cases. Yeah. But anyway, that's good. Good. Any last thoughts there, Joe, about the fifth way, dependent nature, any of that?
Well, I think we basically covered it. I mean, that one line, whatever lacks intelligence cannot move toward an end unless it's directed by something endowed with intelligence. That's the loaded line, right? That we spent the first part of this whole talk unpacking.
That's right.
Right. It's not necessarily clear unless we've done the legwork in the background, which we have, and hopefully it's clearer now.
That's right. Well, Joe, thanks a lot. I really enjoy talking about these things with you and talking about nature and really kind of digging into the kind of the underlying things. Maybe at some point we'll get into the obscure One of my favorite little obscurities in Aristotle is sort of like the arguments for why things in motion have to have parts. So we can get into some of that stuff, but when you start to unearth some of the stuff that you hear in Aristotle and Thomas, at first you're just sort of like, well, why the heck do you think that? Right. It just doesn't sound like immediately convincing. Right. But actually once you dig into it, you're like, oh no, there's a lot there. So I hope our all of our listeners and viewers benefited and from what we talked about, enjoyed it. I found this discussion useful and edifying. Until next time, God bless.